One of the many services IAG M&A Advisors offers our client business sellers is assigning them one of our experienced transaction specialists. This service providing sellers these experienced intermediary specialists is extremely important to getting a business sold successfully and profitably. The reality in the merger and acquisitions arena, or selling a non-publicly traded business with values in the hundreds of thousands of dollars or in the lower millions of dollars, is it is truly very difficult to get transactions successfully closed. If it's not one side or the other's attorney or accountants who create unnecessary obstacles and often foul up the deal, there are so many other reasons. The buyer or the seller can simply change their mind or get cold feet. The financing could simply not become available. The buyer or the seller can get emotionally disturbed by one thing or another, whether real or imagined. The due diligence time frame can bring up issues, whether on the buyer's side or the seller's side. The risk is perceived to be one-sided by either the buyer or the seller or both. The buyer changes the offer, or the seller or buyer change their mind regarding terms or conditions, to name but a few of the many challenges that can occur. While all of the above is true, the possibility of the transaction specialist, the IAG deal handler, doing or saying what might have changed a potential failure into a success is also an important consideration that is often the case. Most acquisition efforts fail, for many reasons, whether financial, emotional, or practical, without the assistance and skill of a professional to act as the intermediary to keep both sides, buyer and seller, on track and to explain, resolve, or diffuse any potential obstacles that always arise in the process. It is therefore not an easy task to guide a transaction between buyer and seller to a successful conclusion. IAG transaction specialists need to have many talents: the ability to communicate, credibility, the skill to establish rapport, and to be seen as critical to the deal. But there is one more skill set that is critical: the ability to create scenarios that are perceived as a win-win from both the seller and the buyer's side. That skill set requires the ability to be creative, on the one hand, and to know and understand financials and how to present the economics on the other. Before I give you some examples on how transaction specialists at IAG M&A Advisors might make a sale possible that would otherwise never even start the process or would otherwise fall by the wayside, let's review what diverse services and skills our transaction specialists provide to assist IAG client businesses in being successfully and profitably sold. Among those services and business, with client business owners, especially those who have never sold a business previously. Reviewing financials with the client business owners to clarify all add-backs that can be justified and supported to raise the adjusted net income or to establish the real cash flow of the business, as potential buyers typically only think in terms of multiples of net income or cash flow in their consideration of value or what to offer. Speaking or otherwise communicating with every inquiry about the business for which they are the transaction specialist assigned in order to determine the potential buyer's interest and ability to purchase that business and to make sure that they have signed an NDA, confidentiality and non-disclosure agreement. Notifying business owners of those who have signed NDAs so that they are kept in the loop. Providing those potential buyer prospects with the information they need to evaluate their interest in acquiring the business. This includes offering memorandums or CBRs, confidential business reviews, financials, P&Ls, balance sheets, equipment and asset lists, cash flow statements, etc., as well as notes that demonstrate appropriate adjustments from the actual financial statements purposefully designed to minimize profits and taxes. When appropriate, setting up conference calls or personal meetings between all parties, buyers and sellers, or getting buyer questions to sellers for specific answers, which typically occurs after some initial conversation and information sharing between transaction specialists and prospective buyers. Identifying creative scenarios to make an acquisition a win-win position for both the buyer and the seller, which might include finding the buyer financing, arranging for seller financing, or some fraction of the sale price. Answering questions regarding financing concerns, management issues, transition period possibilities, and many more. Answering questions from business owners about the adequate presence or absence of prospective buyers and how they can be made more plentiful, from discussing asking price to other possibilities, such as marketing to external sites, creating carefully executed prospect searches, when appropriate, finding strategic buyer prospects with interest in the seller's particular type of business. Following up with potential buyers to make sure that they are still interested or to encourage them to start to seriously look at the business as a possible acquisition. encouraging qualified and interested buyer prospects to write an LOI or letter of intent to purchase, and even helping them create this document which spells out the basic terms that the buyer would consider in purchasing the business. Holding hands, listening carefully to both sides, the sellers and the buyer's concerns, so that the possible sale doesn't fall by the wayside, and suggesting solutions or explanations to put the negotiations back on a positive track. When needed or necessary, helping to create the definitive purchase agreement so that the sale can make proper progress towards a successful conclusion. Once an LOI is signed by the sellers, available to assist in the due diligence period is needed. All along this process, listening, consulting, creatively suggesting ways or scenarios to move the transaction along successfully so that a sale can be concluded. And finally, what transaction specialists don't do. 1. Offer legal advice, although they may have a general discussion about things to consider. 2. Offer tax advice, although they may have a general discussion about things to discuss with your tax attorney or CPA. 3. Inform buyers of private information that is confidential between the business owners and the transaction specialists. In a nutshell, what IAG Transaction Specialists do in addition to procuring buyers and vetting them is 1. Get potential buyer or buyers interested. 2. Get a potential buyer or buyers to see the merit and the value in purchasing the business. 3. Get both the buyer and seller on board as to how the transaction might best be put together to create a win-win scenario that has the best chance to actually cross the finish line. 4. Be in a position to mediate, as the buyer and seller are, by their very nature, skeptical of the information they receive from one another, and obtaining answers and explanations from a neutral, unemotional source like a transaction specialist is often critical. So let's talk about what can be said. First of all, while many buyers simply look at multiples of EBITDA, the net profit plus the acceptable add-backs like interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization, or SDE, the seller's discretionary earnings, which would add what the sellers pay themselves plus any special perks, understanding that buyers want to pay as small a multiple as possible. Transaction specialists can change the narrative to ROI, return on investment, instead of multiple, as follows. We had a buyer prospect ask about a business that was asking for $875,000 but only had an SDE of approximately $175,000. From the potential buyer's point of view, that was 5 times earnings and was, in their opinion, way too high. Here's what was explained to that prospective buyer that changed the conversation. Let me ask you a question. If we could find you this exact kind of business for $1 million, and you could get a 30% return on your investment, or show you another of the same kind of business for only $500,000, but it would only give you a 10% return on investment, which would you be more likely to buy? Their answer was that they would be more likely to buy the $1 million business to get a 3-time better ROI. So having gotten the admission, the narrative continued as follows. So let's say we could get the seller to accept $750,000 for the business, have the seller carry 15% for 5 years, say at 4% interest, get you financing at 6% for 75% for 10 years, leaving you only 10% or $75,000 to put down. The payback on the 75% loan would be around $6,250 per month or $75,000 per year. The payback on the 15% financing by the seller would be around $2,075 per month or $25,000 per year. So for the first 5 years, the business would have to pay the debt service of $100,000, leaving $75,000 as the ROI on your $75,000 investment. That is a 100% return on investment for the first 5 years, even if you don't improve the business. For the second 5 years, the business would pay a debt service of $75,000, leaving a $100,000 ROI or a 133% ROI. Can you see that would be a great deal for both you and the seller? The answer was yes. They could see that possibility, and this prospective buyer was willing to go forward, and the seller could see that they would get a whole lot more up front, at least 85%, and had a good chance of getting their business sold, perhaps for the full $875,000. Oftentimes, transaction specialists need to explain to sellers how buyers look at businesses and explain that it is different than how sellers look at their businesses. We know there are lots of options for buyers, just as there are often many houses to choose from. So it is important to understand what buyers are looking for and how they evaluate one business versus another. We can discuss strategic buyers who are buying a business to expand the possibilities of their own, but often strategic buyers are not interested in smaller mom-and-pop businesses. There are financial buyers who are looking at which businesses offer the best return on their investment and the least risk. So they are looking at stability or defined upward movement, clearly understandable cash flow and net profits, and possibly management and key employees in place. The assets like inventory or equipment are not what they consider, unless they are critical to obtaining a loan. Finally, there are economic or livelihood buyers who are looking to own a business that can support them and their family, where the important numbers are how much they can earn from the business and whether it can be operated successfully. In all cases, the buyers will look at the business differently because their motives are different that the seller looks at their business. Our job is to get the seller to understand how prospective buyers might see the business and its financials and future possibility, and get the buyer prospects to understand the business in terms of how it might meet their needs and expectations. This requires transaction specialists to be good communicators and adjudicators. Leaving it to buyers or sellers to figure it out is usually not a good strategy, especially if they seek advice from their attorneys or accountants who they perceive as knowledgeable and expert, but typically are neither when it comes to buying or selling a business. Therefore, it is the transaction specialist's job to educate both the seller and the buyer in the process so that both can perceive the sale and the acquisition as a win for them. Not every business or buyer prospect can be convinced, as we all know, but we only have to change a few minds with realistic scenarios and good explanations of why each side needs to ensure that the other side can see the transaction as a win for them to dramatically increase the number of successful closings and have satisfied buyers and sellers. To this end, we know that sometimes, too often, when the LOI, the letter of intent to purchase a business, or the actual purchase agreement are written by either side's lawyers or reviewed by either side's lawyers or accountants, that they will, to show that they are looking out for their client's best interests, find reasons to belittle or change the possible deal so that it is one-sided and one side or the other cannot see it as a win for them, just for the other. When it is appropriate, we are often able to make sure that these documents are fair to both sides, and at times we can offer at a much smaller expense that would either pay to a lawyer the option to create the letter of intent, or more importantly, the purchase agreement, which can then be reviewed by their lawyer or accountant at a fraction of the expense they might otherwise pay. When we prepare such a document, it will be for an effort to make it a win-win scenario, showing benefits and protections for both sides. In conclusion, IAG Transaction Specialists are an important and valuable service that is included when a client business engages IAG M&A advisors. In essence, in addition to the professionally and independently prepared information memorandum and valuation and the marketing and access to IAG's buyer database, the provisions of getting an experienced transaction specialist assigned to that business is, in some sellers' and buyers' opinions, the most valuable service IAG provides its clients. Their expertise and involvement is often the difference between stimulating offers and guiding the business through to a successful conclusion or not. I hope this somewhat limited review, without providing literally dozens of examples of how the transaction specialist was able to successfully guide a sale through to completion by finding ways to resolve the many and frequent challenges that always crop up in any potential sale, has helped you to understand the role of value of IAG's transaction specialists.